On the last day of August in 1854, on a narrow street in the Soho district of London, a little girl fell ill, and within a week 500 of her neighbours were dead. The street was called Broad Street, and the child was the infant daughter of a policeman named Lewis. And her mother, Sarah, did what any tired mother would do. She rinsed the soiled napkins in a bucket and tipped the water into the cesspit at the front of the house. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that the cesspit sat only 3 feet from the brickwork of the neighbourhood's most beloved water pump, and that its wall had cracked, and that the sickness in that bucket was seeping quietly and invisibly into the very water that half of Soho carried home in jugs and kettles each morning. And so the people drank. They drank because the Broad Street pump was famous for its cool, clear, sweet-tasting water, so sweet that people walked streets out of their way to fill their bottles there, so sweet that a widow across the city in a leafy Hampstead had it delivered to her by cart because she could not bear the taste of any other. Within days the widow was dead too, killed by water she loved, miles from the street that poisoned it. This is where our journey begins tonight, in the flickering lamplight of a city that did not yet understand. The thing that was killing it, and in the mind of one quiet doctor who was about to change medicine forever by doing something almost no one else had thought to do. He made a map. His name was John Snow, and while the rest of London was busy blaming the smell of the air, he went out into the dying streets with a pencil and marked house by house exactly where the dead had fallen, until the marks themselves drew a shape. And the shape pointed like an accusing finger straight at that lovely, sweet, murderous pump. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know, and it means I get to keep making these long, slow journeys into the strange and human corners of history for you. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. So if you feel like it, post your location and your local time in the comments below. It's one of my favourite things. Scrolling through in the morning and finding someone in Manila where it's the middle of the afternoon, and someone in Ohio where it's just past midnight, and someone in a fishing town in Norway where the sun has barely set at all. We're a strange little midnight congregation, you and I, scattered across every time zone there is, and I like knowing you're out there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because tonight we are going to do something that sounds, at first, a little bit ridiculous. We are going to take all those odd, fussy, superstitious-sounding rules that the Victorians lived by, all the things that make us chuckle and shake our heads from the comfort of our centrally heated, antibiotic-protected modern lives, and we are going to turn them over gently in our hands, the way you might turn over a stone on a beach, to see what is living underneath. Because here is the secret, the thing I most want you to carry with you into sleep tonight. An astonishing number of those silly Victorian rules were right, not for the reasons they thought, almost never for the reasons they thought, but right all the same, stumbled upon in the dark, defended with the wrong arguments, and yet quietly saving lives all the while. Picture the world you are stepping into. It is roughly the middle of the 19th century, and you are alive in the greatest and filthiest city the world has ever seen. London holds more than 2 million souls, more people than any city in the history of the human race up to this moment. And it has grown far, far faster than anyone knew how to manage. The streets are a churn of horse dung and coal smoke and the breath of a million chimneys. The River Thames, the great artery running through the heart of it all, is little more than an open sewer. And on a hot day the smell of it can stop a grown man in his tracks. There are no antibiotics. There is no understanding, not yet, of germs. If you cut your hand badly, there is a very real chance that the cut, not the injury, will kill you within a fortnight. Half the children born in the poorest districts will not live to see their 5th birthday. And into this world, this loud, reeking, magnificent, dangerous world, the doctors and mothers and nurses and quacks and reformers of the age poured every scrap of common sense and folk wisdom and desperate guesswork they possessed. Trying to keep the people they loved alive, they got a great deal wrong, and we will laugh at some of it together tonight gently. The way you laugh at a beloved and slightly foolish great-grandparent. They bled people who were already weak. They dosed babies with opium to keep them quiet. They believed, most of them, that disease travelled on bad smells, on a poisonous vapour they called miasma, a word that simply meant pollution in the air. But hidden inside that wrong idea, tangled up with all the nonsense, were rules of the most practical genius. Open your windows. Air your bedding in the sun. Keep away from the stink of the river. Wash the sick room down. Do not drink from a fouled well. Boil your water for tea. Each of these was defended with a theory we now know to be mistaken, and each of these quietly worked. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let us begin to walk together through the strange and surprisingly wise world of Victorian medicine, starting with the doctor and his map and the pump that never should have been trusted. You're standing now at the corner of Broad Street, and the year is still 1854, and the doctor with the pencil is walking toward you through the September gloom. John Snow was not a loud man. He was the son of a Yorkshire labourer, a quiet, careful, teetotal vegetarian who drank only water. He had boiled himself, which in hindsight was one of the luckiest habits a man in that city could have had. He had already made his name as the physician who administered chloroform to Queen Victoria herself during the birth of her children. A scandalous novelty at the time, for many believed a mother was meant to suffer. But it was not anaesthesia that would make him immortal. It was this map. Snow believed, against nearly the entire weight of medical opinion, that cholera was not floating through the air on a bad smell at all, but was being swallowed, carried in water, fouled by the waste of the sick. And so, as the bodies piled up around Broad Street, he did the patient, unglamorous, revolutionary thing. He knocked on doors, he asked where the dead had drawn their water, and he drew, on a street plan of Soho, a small black bar for every death, stacking them outside the houses where they fell. When the map was done, it told a story so clear that you would have to be willfully blind not to see it. The black bars clustered thick and heavy around a single point, growing denser and denser as they neared the Broad Street pump, and thinning to almost nothing as you walked away from it in any direction. But the true genius of Snow was in the exceptions, the houses that broke the pattern, because it is the exceptions that prove the case. There was a workhouse nearby, packed with hundreds of poor inmates, that should by rights have been devastated, and yet barely anyone there died. Why? Because the workhouse had its own private well and its own pump, and its people almost never troubled to walk to Broad Street. And there was a brewery on the street itself, the Lion Brewery, whose workers sat squarely in the deadliest zone, and yet not one of them fell ill. Why? Because the brewer, a sensible man named Huggins, gave his men a daily allowance of malt liquor, and so they drank beer all day and never touched the pump. Historians still argue whether the pump handle actually stopped the outbreak, or whether the epidemic was already burning itself out by the time it was removed. But no one disputes what Snow had proven on paper. So picture the scene, because it is one of the quiet turning points of the whole modern world. On the 7th of September, Snow stood before the Board of Guardians of the parish of St. James, a room full of sceptical, frightened, ordinary men, and he laid his map before them and asked them to do one simple thing. Take the handle off the pump. Make it impossible to drink the water. They did not believe his theory. Almost no one believed his theory. But they were desperate. And the request was small, and so the next day a workman came and unbolted the handle of the Broad Street pump and carried it away. And the sweet, clear, beloved, poisonous water was locked beneath the street where no one could reach it. And the dying, which had already begun to slow, stopped. It is one of the most famous gestures in the history of public health, that handle lifted away, and you can still visit the spot today, where a replica pump stands without a handle as a monument, and where, in a lovely touch, the pub on the corner is named the John Snow. Now here is where the strange lesson of tonight begins to bite, because you might think the removal of that handle changed everything overnight. And it did not. Snow was, for the rest of his short life, largely ignored. He died in 1858, only 4 years later at the age of 45, and most of the great and good of medicine still believed that cholera rode upon foul air. The idea that a bad smell could carry disease was simply too obvious, too intuitive, too satisfying to give up. And this is the thing I want you to hold gently as you drift tonight. The Victorians were not stupid. They were reasoning carefully and honestly from the evidence of their own noses. When they walked past the reeking Thames or a heap of rotting rubbish and then fell ill, the connection seemed plain. Bad air, bad health. It was a theory that fit the feeling of the world. And the truly fascinating part, The part that makes this whole subject so much richer than a simple story of ignorance overcome is that the wrong theory kept leading them, again and again, to do the right thing. Because if you believe that disease comes from foul air rising off filth and stagnant water and human waste, what do? You clean up the filth, you drain the stagnant water, you carry the waste away from where people live. You build sewers, you scrub the streets, you throw open the windows. Every single one of those actions, undertaken to banish an imaginary poison vapour, also happened to remove the very real bacteria that were doing the killing. The Victorians were like a man who keeps a cat because he believes it wards off evil spirits, and who never realises that the true blessing of the cat is that it quietly kills the rats that carry the plague. They were right by accident, right for the wrong reasons, and saved untold thousands of lives while arguing passionately for a theory that was completely mistaken. And over the next couple of hours, as the fan hums and your eyes grow heavy, we're going to wander through rule after rule after rule just like this one, each one stranger and more human than the last. And I promise you will never look at a Victorian open window the same way again. Let us stay with that mistaken idea a little longer, this notion of miasma, because it ruled the Victorian mind so completely that you cannot understand any of their rules without it. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or defilement, and the theory held that disease was carried by a kind of poisonous night vapour that rose from rotting matter, from swamps and graveyards and dung heaps, and, above all, from the great foul river running through the city. If you could smell it, the reasoning went, it could hurt you. Bad air made bad blood. It was an idea older than the Romans, and by the 19th century it had hardened into unshakable common sense, believed by peasants and professors alike. And you can hardly blame them, because the poor lived in the smelliest, most crowded, most disease-ridden districts, while the rich lived up on the breezy hills. And so the correlation between stench and sickness seemed absolutely watertight. The fatal flaw, of course, was that the smell and the sickness shared a single hidden cause. Human filth teeming with unseen life, and the Victorians blamed the smell while the true killer slipped past unnoticed in the water and on unwashed hands. And then came the summer that made the whole city choke, the summer they still call the Great Stink. It was 1858, a hot, dry, breathless June, and the Thames, which had for years been used as a dumping ground for the waste of 3 million people and their factories and slaughterhouses, simply ran out of the ability to hide what it was. The water level dropped, the filth baked on the exposed banks, and a smell rose off the river so monstrous, so physically overwhelming, that it stopped the government itself. The Houses of Parliament sit directly on the bank of the Thames, and the honourable members found they could not breathe. They soaked the curtains in chloride of lime to try to blot out the reek. They debated fleeing upriver to Oxford, and finally, gagging at their own desks. They did in a matter of weeks what reformers had begged them to do for decades. They voted the money to build a sewer system. Nothing concentrates the mind of a politician quite like a smell he cannot escape. The man they handed the task to was an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, and what he built beneath London is one of the quiet marvels of the age, a vast hidden network of brick tunnels, more than 1,000 miles of them, running in great intercepting sewers along the river to carry the city's waste far downstream and away from where people drew their drinking water. Bazalgette, in a stroke of foresight that historians still praise, calculated the largest pipe he thought London would ever need, and then doubled the diameter, just in case, a decision that kept his sewers working for well over a century. And here is the beautiful irony at the heart of it all. Bazalgette built his sewers to banish the smell, to defeat the miasma, to clear the poison vapour from the air. He was, in his own mind, fighting bad air. But by carrying the sewage away from the drinking water, he unknowingly cut the true lifeline of cholera, and after his sewers were finished, the great cholera epidemics that had killed tens of thousands simply stopped coming. The right thing, done for the wrong reason, and a city saved almost by accident. So when you hear a Victorian sanitary reformer thundering about the dangers of foul air, do not roll your eyes too quickly. Yes, the mechanism was wrong. But the instinct, clean up the filth, move the waste away from the people, was precisely right, and it did more to lengthen the human lifespan than almost any drug or surgery of the century. Historians still argue about how many lives the sewers saved, with estimates running into the hundreds of thousands. But no one doubts that the answer is enormous, And there is a quirky little footnote to all this that I love. For years after the sewers were built, a stubborn faction of doctors insisted the improvement had nothing to do with the water and everything to do with the cleaner air. And they kept right on believing in miasma even as the evidence buried it, which only goes to show that a comfortable idea will cling to the human mind long after the facts have let go of it. Now let your breathing slow and imagine yourself walking through that changing city, past the newly dug trenches and the great brick tunnels going in beneath the roads, and think about how strange it must have been to live at the very moment the world was quietly being rescued and hardly anyone understood how. The people of the time simply noticed that things were getting better. The cholera stopped. The typhoid eased. Babies who would have died began more often to live, and they credited the fresh air, the drains, the removal of the stink, all the visible improvements, never quite grasping that the real hero was the humble separation of clean water from dirty. It is one of the gentlest lessons in all of history, that you do not always need to understand a thing correctly in order to do it right, and that sometimes a whole civilization can grope its way toward the truth in the dark, guided by nothing more than a horror of bad smells and a stubborn, decent wish to keep the people alive. Hold that thought softly as we move on, because the next rule we meet grew straight out of this same fear of foul air, and it is one you have almost certainly heard from your own grandmother. The rule is this: open the windows, let the air move, never ever sleep in a shut-up, stuffy, airless room. To the Victorians this was not a mere preference. It was close to a moral commandment, and the great high priestess of it, whom we shall meet properly in a little while, was Florence Nightingale, who believed that stale, stagnant, rebreathed air was one of the deadliest things a sick person could be surrounded by. Fresh air, constantly moving, was the first requirement of any sick room, day or night, summer or winter. Nurses were instructed to keep windows open even in the depths of a London January, to pile blankets on the patient if they must, but never to let the air go still and close and used up around them. It sounds, to modern ears, faintly cruel, this business of flinging open the sash while a fever patient shivers, and yet, once again, the Victorians had stumbled onto something genuinely true. Because here is the thing that we now understand, and they did not. Many of the great killers of the age, tuberculosis above all, but also influenza and measles and diphtheria and whooping cough, spread through the air in tiny droplets breathed and coughed and sneezed out by the sick. In a sealed, crowded, unventilated room, those infectious droplets hang in the air and build up, and everyone who breathes that air breathes them in, over and over, at ever greater concentration. Open a window and the moving air sweeps them away and dilutes them to nothing. The Victorians thought they were banishing miasma, the poison vapour of decay. What they were actually doing was ventilating away real, living, airborne germs and cutting the transmission of some of the deadliest diseases they faced. It is very nearly the exact same advice that public health authorities gave during the great respiratory pandemic of our own century. Open the windows, bring in fresh air. Do not let people gather in stuffy sealed rooms, and it turns out your great-great-grandmother, shivering by her open sash and muttering about the dangers of stale air, had the essential science right all along, even if her explanation of it would make a modern doctor wince. There was a particular Victorian terror, though that shows just how tangled the wisdom and the nonsense were, and that was the fear of night air. Fresh air by day was medicine, but night air, they believed, was uniquely dangerous, thick with the worst of the miasma, and so people who threw their windows wide at noon would seal them tight at dusk, drawing the curtains and shutting out the very thing they had been told to love. Malaria, whose name literally means bad air in Italian, seemed to confirm it, because people who slept near marshes with their windows open at night really did fall ill far more often. But the true reason had nothing to do with the darkness of the air and everything to do with a small whining insect. Mosquitoes, which carry malaria, bite mostly at night and rise from exactly those marshy places, and a person sleeping by an open window near a swamp was simply offering himself up to be bitten. Close the window, or better yet hang a net, and the risk fell, and so the fear of night air was, in that specific case, protecting people for a reason no one correctly understood until much later. Historians still argue about how deeply the night air fear helped or harmed on balance, since it also kept people cooped up in stuffy rooms breathing each other's tuberculosis, but you can see how a single stubborn superstition could be half wise and half foolish at the very same time, and it did not stop at windows. The obsession with moving air shaped the very buildings the Victorians raised. Their grand new hospitals were built long and thin in what were called pavilion wards, so that windows could face each other across the room and air, could sweep clean through from one side to the other. High ceilings, tall windows, wide-spaced beds, all of it designed to keep the air in motion and never let stagnate over the sick. We now know that this spacing of beds and this flow of fresh air did genuinely reduce the spread of infection from patient to patient at a time when hospitals could be terrifyingly deadly places, so lethal that they were sometimes grimly nicknamed the gateways to death. The Airy Pavilion Hospital, born of a fear of invisible vapours, turned out to be one of the better designs for keeping real germs from leaping bed to bed, and versions of it were built all over the world for the better part of a century. So the next time you are in a stuffy room and feel that instinctive itch to crack a window, that little restlessness in the chest, know that you are feeling something very old and very wise. An instinct the Victorians raised almost to a religion. They dressed it up in a false theory of poison vapours, and they took it to strange extremes. And they frightened themselves half to death over the harmless dark of night. But underneath it all sat a solid, life-saving truth. Moving air is cleaner air. Crowded, sealed, rebreathed air makes people sick, and a window thrown open to the night, whatever the poets and the doctors feared, was more often a doorway to health than to harm. Let that image carry you gently onward, a white curtain lifting in a night breeze, as we turn now to the woman who did more than anyone to make that open window a rule. Before we meet her properly, let us follow the fresh air rule out of the window and into the yard, because it led the Victorians to another habit that looks quaint and turns out to be quietly brilliant. They aired everything in the sun. Bedding was hauled out of the house on fine mornings and draped over lines and hedges and windowsills. Mattresses were dragged into the light. Blankets and pillows and linens were spread across the grass to bake, and this was done not merely for the pleasant smell of sunshine in the sheets, though they loved that too, but because they believed sunlight and open air drove the poison out of cloth. A dark, damp, shut-up room was thought to breed disease, while a bright, sunny, well-aired one was thought to banish it, and so a good housewife or a careful nurse would fling back the curtains, let the sun pour in, and turn the bedding to the light as faithfully as she said her prayers. And here, yet again, they were touching a real truth with the wrong hand. Sunlight is a genuine disinfectant. The ultraviolet rays in ordinary daylight really do kill many bacteria, break down their delicate machinery, and leave a surface far cleaner than the shadows ever could. Damp, dark cloth is a paradise for germs and mould and the tiny mites that thrive in a slept-in bed, while cloth dried in bright sun and moving air becomes an inhospitable desert for them. So when the Victorians insisted that sunlight was healthful and darkness was sickly, they were not merely being poetic. They had noticed, across countless households and countless years, that people in bright airy homes tended to fare better than people in dim, damp, sunless ones, and they built a rule around it. They could not have told you about ultraviolet wavelengths or bacterial cell walls, but they knew the sun was on their side, and they were right. There is even a whole later medical tradition, heliotherapy, the deliberate treatment of illness with sunlight, that grew directly out of this Victorian faith. And while much of it was overdone, the core insight that sunlight kills germs and that light and air heal has never been overturned. They took the same instinct to the walls of their homes and hospitals in the form of whitewash and lime. Sick rooms and cellars and stables and the wards of the poor were regularly slapped with a fresh coat of lime wash, that thin white paint of slaked lime and water, partly to brighten the space and reflect the precious light, and partly because they felt, quite correctly as it happens, that it cleaned and purified the surface. Lime is genuinely antiseptic, strongly alkaline, hostile to bacteria, and a freshly lime-washed wall really is a more hygienic wall, so the annual ritual of whitewashing the sick room, undertaken to sweeten the air and drive out the miasma, was doing honest microbial work all the while. It is a lovely thing to picture, an army of Victorian housekeepers and orderlies with their brushes and buckets, coating the world in clean white lime every spring, fighting an enemy they could not see with a weapon they did not understand, and winning more often than they lost. There is a quirky tidbit here that never fails to make me smile. So convinced were the Victorians of the healthfulness of light and air that they came to distrust heavy curtains, thick carpets, and cluttered, overstuffed rooms, precisely because those things trapped dust and blocked the sun. And a whole strand of Victorian household advice reads like a war against the very heavy velvet gloom we now think of as so typically Victorian. The plainer, lighter, more washable the home, the healthier, they said, and there is real truth in it, because dust and damp and darkness genuinely do harbour more of the things that make us ill. Historians still argue about how much these household rules actually improved health compared with the big structural changes like clean water and sewers. But at the level of a single sick room, a single bed, a single child fighting a fever, the sunlight and the fresh air and the clean white walls surely helped, and they cost almost nothing but effort. So let this be the picture that settles over you now, soft and warm as you sink a little deeper into your pillow. A Victorian morning, the windows flung wide, white sheets billowing on a line in the garden, sunlight lying in bright bars across a scrubbed floor, and the smell of lime and fresh air filling a room that only yesterday held sickness. It is a homely, ordinary, beautiful scene, and it is also, quietly, a scene of war, of the human race pushing back against the invisible tide of disease with nothing more than sun and soap and open windows and stubborn daily care. They did not know what they were fighting, but they fought it well, and the woman who understood better than anyone how much those simple things mattered, who turned airing and scrubbing and sunlight into a discipline that saved thousands of soldiers' lives, is waiting for us now in a filthy, overcrowded barrack hospital on the far shore of the Black Sea, with a lamp in her hand and a look of thunderous determination on her face. Her name, of course, is Florence Nightingale, and to understand why she matters you must first stand with her in the place that made her, a converted barracks in a town called Scutari, across the water from the city then known as Constantinople, in the autumn of 1854. Britain was fighting the Crimean War, and the wounded and sick were being shipped back across the Black Sea to this vast, grim building, and what Nightingale found when she arrived with her small band of nurses was very nearly beyond belief. The hospital was built, it turned out, on top of a broken sewer. The wards were packed with men lying in their own filth, without clean linen, without proper food, without soap, without enough chamber pots, the floors rotten, the water supply contaminated, the air thick with the stench of infection and human waste. Men who had survived their wounds on the battlefield were dying here by the hundreds, not from Russian bullets, but from cholera and typhus and dysentery in the general. Grinding filth of the place. More British soldiers in that war died of disease than ever died of their wounds. Many, many more. And the hospital that was meant to save them was one of the deadlier spots of all. Nightingale, who came from a wealthy family and had defied every expectation of her class and sex to become a nurse, set about the problem with a ferocious methodical practicality that is genuinely thrilling to read about. She was not. At this point, a believer in germs no one was. She was a devout believer in the miasma theory, in the danger of foul air and filth and stench. But precisely because she believed that filth and bad air killed, she waged total war on them. She demanded hundreds of scrubbing brushes. She had the wards cleaned, the men washed, clean shirts and clean sheets provided, decent food cooked. She organised the chaos of supplies with the mind of a brilliant administrator, which is what, beneath the saintly legend, she truly was. And at night, when the surgeons and orderlies had gone to their beds, she walked the miles of wards alone with a small lamp in her hand, checking on the men and the soldiers, who adored her, began to call her the lady with the lamp, and to kiss her shadow as it fell across their pillows in the dark. Now, the honest historian must add a complication here, and it is a fascinating one that people still argue about. When Nightingale first arrived and began her cleaning, the death rate at Scutari did not immediately fall. In fact, through that first terrible winter it stayed appallingly high, and some scholars believe it may even have risen. Because the underlying problem, the sewage soaking up through the very foundations, had not yet been addressed. The great turning point came in the spring of 1855, when a sanitary commission sent out from London arrived and did the deeper structural work, flushing out the sewers beneath the building, clearing the water supply, removing the dead animals rotting in the system. After that, the death rate collapsed, falling from something like 2 in 5 of the men admitted to, a small fraction of that. Nightingale herself, characteristically honest, came to understand later that it was the sanitation, the drains and the clean water that had done the greatest work, and she spent much of the rest of her life campaigning for exactly those things. But do not let the complication rob her of her due, because here is the point that matters for our story tonight. Whether her early scrubbing saved lives that first winter or not, the whole thrust of her method — cleanliness, fresh air, clean water, good food, light, warmth, quiet, space between the beds — was profoundly, durably right, and she went on to teach it to the entire world. She turned nursing from a disreputable job done by the desperate into a trained, honourable profession. She wrote a small book called Notes on Nursing that ordinary mothers and housekeepers bought by the thousands, distilling her rules for keeping the sick alive, and nearly every rule in it, whatever theory she hung it on, holds up astonishingly well today. Keep the air fresh, keep the patient warm, keep everything scrupulously clean, let in the light, and her insistence on these things, backed by the enormous moral authority she earned at Scutari, did more to spread the gospel of hygiene through Victorian society than a library of medical papers could have done. There is a quirky tidbit about her that I adore and that we will pick up in the next stretch of our journey, because Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, the tender angel of the wards, was also, and this is no exaggeration, one of the most important statisticians of the 19th century, a woman who fought her battles not only with soap and lamplight, but with columns of numbers and a brilliant, now famous diagram that she used to shame the government into reform. But that is a tale for the next part of our slow night walk. For now, simply hold the image of her in your mind as you drift, a slight figure in a plain dark dress moving down a long moonlit ward. The little flame of her lamp passing bed by bed by bed, bringing not medicine, for she had almost none that worked, but something in its way just as powerful, the simple, stubborn, life-giving insistence on cleanliness and care. So let us follow Florence Nightingale home from the war, because the second half of her life is where she quietly performed her greatest miracle, and it is a miracle made not of lamplight, but of arithmetic. When she returned to England, a national heroine, worn down and often bedridden by an illness she'd caught in the Crimea, she could have rested on her fame. Instead, she sat down with the mountains of records she had kept and began to count the dead. She wanted to prove, beyond any sentimental doubt, exactly what had killed all those soldiers, and she understood something that very few people of her age grasped: that numbers, marshalled clearly and honestly, could persuade hard-headed men in power when a passionate speech never could. She became, in the words of later scholars, one of the true pioneers of applied statistics, and she was elected the first woman fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, an astonishing thing for the time. Her masterpiece was a diagram, and if you have never seen it, it is worth picturing as you lie there in the dark because it is beautiful. She arranged the causes of death month by month around a circle, like the petals of a flower or the segments of a fan, and she shaded them in colours, one colour for deaths from wounds, another for deaths from preventable diseases, another for deaths from all other causes. And when you looked at the finished picture, the truth leapt out at you with the force of a slap. The great blue wedges of death from disease, from the filth and the bad water and the crowding, dwarfed the little red slivers of death from actual battle. You did not need to understand statistics. You did not need to read a single number. You simply looked and you saw, in one glance, that the war was killing far more of its own soldiers through neglect than the enemy was killing through violence, and that nearly all of it could have been prevented with clean water and clean air and clean wards. That diagram, sent to Queen Victoria and to the ministers and generals, did more to reform the health of the British Army than any amount of pleading, and versions of it are still taught to students of statistics and design today as one of the first and finest examples of using a picture to tell the truth. And out of all this labour came her little book, Notes on Nursing, published in 1859, and it is here that the whole spirit of tonight's journey shines most clearly, because the book is essentially a list of rules, homely, practical, unglamorous rules, nearly every one of which we now know to be sound. Ventilation first and above all. She wrote, "Keep the air the patient breathes as pure as the air outside." Light, real sunlight, she insisted, was second only to fresh air in importance. And she noted, with the sharp eye of a born observer, that patients placed near windows and sunlight seemed to recover better than those left in the gloom, an observation that modern hospital studies have remarkably gone on to confirm. Cleanliness of the room, of the bedding, of the patient, of the nurse's own hands. Warmth. Quiet, for she believed rightly that needless noise and sudden shocks drained the strength of the sick. Good, carefully chosen food given at the right times. None of it sounds revolutionary to us now, and that is precisely the measure of her victory, that the things she had to fight for have become so obvious. We forget they were ever in doubt. The delicious irony, the thread that ties her to everyone else we have met tonight, is that Florence Nightingale went to her grave never fully accepting the germ theory of disease. She remained, to a large degree, a believer in the older idea that sickness rose from filth and foul air and bad conditions, rather than from specific living microbes passing from person to person. Historians still argue about just how much she resisted the new science, and how much she quietly absorbed it in her later years. But here is the wonderful thing, the thing I want you to carry into sleep. It did not matter. Her rules were right regardless of the theory behind them. Whether the enemy was a poison vapour or a living germ, the answer was the same. Clean air, clean water, clean hands, clean wards, light and warmth and rest and care. And because she fought so fiercely and counted so carefully and wrote so clearly, those answers spread across the world and became the foundation of modern nursing. So the woman with the lamp turns out to have been, all along, a woman with a slide rule and a set of coloured pencils, wielding numbers like a surgeon wields a knife, cutting through the comfortable ignorance of the powerful to save the lives of ordinary men, and that brings us, gently, to the next great Victorian rule, the one that sounds the most obvious of all to us, and was the most bitterly, tragically resisted in its own time, a rule that one doctor discovered years before anyone was ready to listen, and that cost him his career, his sanity, and finally his life. The rule is almost absurdly simple. Wash your hands. And the story of the man who begged the world to do it, and was mocked and broken for his trouble, is one of the saddest and most important tales in all of medicine. Let it come to you now as your breathing slows and the room grows soft around you. Travel back a few years and a few hundred miles to a great hospital in the city of Vienna in the year 1847, and meet a young doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, a serious, intense, troubled man who's about to notice something that will torment him. For the rest of his days, he works in the maternity division of the Vienna General Hospital, one of the largest in the world, and it is divided into two clinics where poor women come to give birth. The first clinic is staffed by doctors and medical students, the second is staffed by midwives. And there is a horror hanging over the first clinic that everyone knows about, that the women themselves know about, that they weep and beg to avoid. In the doctor's clinic, mothers are dying of childbed fever, puerperal fever, at a terrifying rate, sometimes 1 in 6, sometimes even more, while in the midwife's clinic, just next door, far fewer die. The women are so afraid of the deadly first clinic that some of them would rather give birth in the street outside than be admitted to it, and Semmelweis notices with growing anguish that these street births somehow suffer less fever than the births attended by the learned doctors inside. Something is terribly wrong and no one can say what. Semmelweis becomes obsessed. He tests idea after idea and discards them. Is it the crowding? No. The midwife's clinic is just as crowded. Is it the climate, the position of the beds, some difference in the women themselves? None of it holds up. And then a tragedy hands him the answer. A colleague of his, a professor, cuts his finger with a scalpel while performing an autopsy on a body, and falls ill and dies, and Semmelweis, reading the account of his friend's illness, is struck like a bell, because the symptoms of the dead professor are precisely the symptoms of the women dying of childbed fever. And suddenly he sees it, the thing that has been hiding in plain sight all along, the doctors and the medical students. Unlike the midwives, spend their mornings in the mortuary, dissecting the corpses of the dead, learning their anatomy, and then they walk straight from the dissecting table to the delivery room and examine the labouring mothers with their bare, unwashed hands, carrying something invisible and lethal from the dead directly into the bodies of the living. He could not have told you it was bacteria. The word, the concept, the whole science did not yet exist. He called it cadaverous particles, some poisonous matter from the corpses clinging to the hands. But he had grasped the essential world-changing truth that the doctors themselves were the carriers, that their own hands were the murder weapon, and that the answer was to wash. He ordered every doctor and student in his clinic to scrub their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, a harsh disinfectant, before touching a single mother, and the effect was immediate and staggering. The death rate in the doctor's clinic plunged, falling within months to match and even beat the midwife's clinic, from a slaughterhouse to a place of safety, purely on the strength of clean hands. He had found it. He had years before anyone else proven that an unseen something on dirty hands could carry death from one patient to another, and that a simple wash could stop it. It should have made him one of the most celebrated doctors in the history of the world. Instead, it destroyed him. The medical establishment of the day, proud, hierarchical, and deeply offended, did not want to hear that their own gentlemanly hands were the instruments of death. The idea was an insult to their dignity and their status. Some could not accept the implied guilt, that they themselves had killed the mothers they meant to save. Semmelweis, who was not a tactful man and who grew ever more furious and desperate as the years passed, wrote bitter, raging letters denouncing his opponents as murderers, which did his cause no good at all. He was pushed out of his positions, his ideas were ridiculed or ignored across most of Europe. And under the weight of it all his mind gave way. In 1865 he was committed to an asylum, and there, in a cruel final irony, he died within weeks, most likely of an infected wound, the very kind of infection he'd spent his life trying to prevent. Killed by the thing he understood better than any man alive. Historians still argue over exactly why the world rejected him so completely, whether it was his abrasive manner, or the lack of a theory to explain his results, or simply the unbearable guilt his discovery implied, but the tragedy is the same however you weigh it. The lesson, wash your hands, could not have been simpler or more true, and it was buried with him, only to be dug up and vindicated a generation later when germ theory finally arrived to explain what he had seen. So the next time you stand at a sink and lather your hands without a second thought, spare a small warm memory for poor tormented Ignaz Semmelweis of Vienna, who saw the truth too soon and paid for it with everything he had. And keep his hands in mind as we turn now to the Englishman who took up the same fight and, with better luck and better timing, finally won it. The Englishman is Joseph Lister, and if Semmelweis is the tragedy of this story, Lister is its triumph, the man who took the same buried truth and, arriving at just the right moment with just the right evidence, finally made the world believe. Lister was a surgeon working in Glasgow in the 1860s. A thoughtful, patient, deeply religious man, and he was haunted by the same horror that haunted every honest surgeon of the age. His operations were often skillful successes. The tumour removed, the bone set, the limb amputated cleanly, and then, days later, the wound would turn red and swollen and begin to stink. And a raging infection would set in, and the patient who had survived the knife would die of the healing. They called it hospital gangrene, or blood poisoning, or ward fever, and it was so common that surgeons half expected it, and so deadly that operating on a patient in a large hospital could be more dangerous than leaving the disease untreated. Nearly half of all amputation patients in some wards died of infection afterward. The wards themselves seemed cursed, and the more crowded and busy the hospital, the worse the curse. The old idea was that this infection was caused, once again, by miasma, by the bad air of the ward acting upon the raw exposed flesh of the wound. But Lister read something that changed his whole understanding. The work of a French chemist named Louis Pasteur, who had shown that the souring of wine and the rotting of meat were not caused by the air itself, but by tiny living organisms carried in the air and in dust and on surfaces, microbes, germs, invisible living things that multiplied and caused decay. And Lister made the great leap. If it was not the air but living germs in the air that caused rot, then perhaps it was living germs, not bad air, that were rotting his patients' wounds, getting into the raw flesh and multiplying there. And if that were true, then the answer was not to fan away the miasma but to kill the germs, to destroy them before they could enter the wound and to keep them out. He needed a weapon, a substance that would kill the invisible invaders, and he found it in carbolic acid, a pungent, oily chemical derived from coal tar that was being used to treat the stinking sewage of the town of Carlisle, and which had been noticed to reduce the diseases of the cattle that grazed on land treated with it. Lister began to use it on his surgical patients with meticulous, obsessive care. He soaked the dressings in it. He washed the wound with it. He cleaned his instruments and his hands in it. For a time, he even had a machine pump a fine mist of carbolic acid into the air of the operating theatre, filling the room with a stinging spray. So determined was he to destroy every germ that might reach the wound. It was harsh. It cracked the skin of his hands. It filled the theatre with choking fumes, and it worked. His patients stopped dying. Wounds that would once have turned septic healed cleanly. The infection rate on his wards fell so dramatically that the results could not be ignored, and in 1867 he published his method to the world. Even then it was not accepted overnight, for old surgeons are as proud and stubborn as old professors, and many scoffed at the idea of invisible germs and refused to change their bloody habits. But the evidence piled up, patient after patient, ward after ward, and Lister lived to see his method spread across the world and to be showered with the honours that poor Semmelweis never knew, becoming a baron, president of the Royal Society, one of the most revered figures in medicine. And there is a small everyday monument to him that sits in your bathroom cabinet right now, because a certain American mouthwash was named Listerine in his honour, a minty tribute to the grim, coal tar-smelling chemical with which he first drove the germs from the surgeon's blade. Historians still argue about exactly how much of his early success came from the carbolic acid itself and how much from the simple cleanliness his whole method demanded, the clean hands and clean instruments and clean dressings. But the outcome is beyond dispute. He had turned surgery from a desperate gamble into something a patient might reasonably survive, and so the rule, wash your hands, clean the wound, kill the unseen thing before it kills the patient, which had broken Semmelweis in Vienna, made Lister a hero in Britain, and the only real difference between them was timing and temperament and the lucky arrival of Pasteur's germs to explain what both men had seen. It is a humbling thought to hold as you drift, that the same truth can destroy one man and crown another depending only on whether the world happens to be ready to hear it. But the world was ready now. At last, and once it had accepted that invisible living things caused infection and disease, a great many of those strange old Victorian rules suddenly made a new and deeper kind of sense. Before we follow that thread, though, let us pause a while longer in the operating theatre itself. In the years before Lister worked his change, because the ordinary reality of Victorian surgery is a thing so vivid and so strange that it deserves a slow, unhurried look, and because it will make you grateful as you lie there warm and safe for the age you were lucky enough to be born into. Step with me, then, into a surgical theatre of the early Victorian age, before antiseptics, before anaesthetics were common, and let your imagination take in a scene that will seem almost medieval in its brutality, though it happened not so very long ago at all. The room is called a theatre for a literal reason, because it is built like one, a steep bowl of wooden galleries rising up around a central wooden table, and those galleries are packed with spectators. Medical students and curious gentlemen leaning in to watch the show. There is sawdust scattered under the table, not for any reason of cleanliness, but simply to soak up the blood so it does not pool too deep on the floor. The surgeon arrives, and here is the detail that tells you everything about the age. He is often wearing an old frock coat stiff and black and crusted with the dried blood and matter of the hundreds of operations that came before, and he wears it with pride, because a coat caked hard with the evidence of long experience marked a busy and successful surgeon, and a clean coat marked a novice. They did not know that the coat was a garden of death. They thought it was a badge of honour. Before anaesthesia, the single most prized quality in a surgeon was speed. Raw, brutal, merciful speed, because every second the patient spent under the knife was a second of unbearable agony, and the faster the surgeon could cut, the better the patient's chance of surviving the sheer shock of the pain. The most famous of these lightning surgeons was a Scotsman named Robert Liston, a giant of a man who could reportedly amputate a leg in under half a minute, and about whom the most gruesomely comic stories in all of medical history are told. In his haste he is said, on one dreadful occasion, to have sliced through the fingers of his own assistant as well as the patient's leg, and to have slashed the coat of a watching spectator who, believing himself stabbed, is said to have died of fright, so that the operation entered legend as the only one in history, with a mortality rate of 300%. Historians still argue about how much that particular tale grew in the telling, as the best stories always do, but it captures a real truth about an age when a surgeon's hands moved faster than any anaesthetic could keep up with. and through it all ran a belief so wrong, so exactly backwards, that it stands as the perfect dark twin to all the accidentally right rules we have been celebrating tonight. When a wound filled with thick pus, the surgeons of the older school were pleased. They called it laudable pus, praiseworthy pus, and believed it was a sign that the body was expelling its bad humours, that the wound was healing as it should. In truth, of course, that pus was the visible sign of a raging bacterial infection, the very thing that was about to kill the patient. And so the doctors greeted the arrival of the killer as a welcome guest and grew alarmed only when it was far too late. It is the mirror image of the fresh air rule and the handwashing rule, a case where a confident theory led them not accidentally right, but confidently. Catastrophically wrong, and it is worth holding the two side by side because together they show you just how blind the age truly was. Groping in the dark, sometimes brushing the truth and sometimes embracing the very thing that would destroy them. Then, in the space of a single generation, two mercies arrived to transform this house of horrors. The first was anesthesia, the discovery in the 1840s that ether and then chloroform could send a patient into a deep, painless sleep so that the surgeon no longer needed to race against the screaming and could work slowly, carefully, precisely. And the second, following close behind, was Lister's antisepsis, the clean hands and clean instruments and germ-killing carbolic that meant the patient who survived the operation now also survived the healing. Together, these two changes remade surgery utterly, from a brief, frantic, agonizing butchery with a coin-toss chance of survival, into something recognizably like the careful, sterile, painless procedure we know today, and it is worth pausing as you lie there in the dark to feel the sheer good fortune of the moment you inhabit, in which a cut hand means a plaster and an antibiotic rather than a fortnight of terror, in which an operation is a thing you sleep through and wake from, rather than a thing you are held down for. But I do not tell you all this merely to make you grateful. Though gratitude is a fine thing to fall asleep on, I tell you because it deepens the wonder of our real subject tonight, those strange old rules that worked. The Victorians lived in that world of blood-stiff coats and laudable pus and screaming theatres, a world of terrifying medical ignorance, and yet, at the very same time, in their homes and their sick rooms and their new-built sewers and their airy hospitals, they were following rule after rule after rule that genuinely quietly saved lives. That is the beautiful contradiction at the heart of the age. They could be so wrong and so right at once, and the same people who praised laudable pus also flung open their windows and aired their sheets in the sun and more washed their hands. So let us leave the operating theatre now and turn to something gentler and more homely. A rule that lived in every Victorian kitchen and touched every Victorian cup of tea. Here is a rule so gentle and so domestic that it hardly seems like a medical rule at all, and yet it may have saved more Victorian lives than any surgeon's knife. When in doubt, drink something that has been boiled. Drink tea, drink small beer. Do not, if you can help it, drink the plain cold water straight from the pump, or the river, or the shallow well in the yard. The Victorians did not, of course, understand why this was wise, for they had no notion that boiling water kills the living germs within it. But they had inherited from generations of hard experience a deep and useful suspicion of raw water and a deep and abiding love of tea, and between the two they stumbled into one of the most effective everyday defences against waterborne disease that a person of that century could possibly have had. Every time a Victorian family filled the kettle and set it over the fire and brewed a pot of tea, they were, without knowing it, boiling their drinking water to a rolling temperature that destroyed the cholera and the typhoid and the dysentery lurking in it, and then drinking it safe. Consider what a difference this made in a city where the water supply was, as we have seen, so often lethal. The very ritual of tea, taken several times a day, morning and afternoon and evening, meant that a large share of the fluid a person drank had passed through a boiling kettle first. Add to this the widespread drinking of small beer, a weak, mildly alcoholic brew that was made by boiling the water as part of the brewing, and which was drunk by adults and children alike as a safer alternative to plain water, and you begin to see a whole society that, quite by accident, drank a great deal of its daily fluid in a form that had been sterilized by heat or protected by fermentation. Remember the brewery workers on Broad Street who drank beer all day and did not catch the cholera that killed their neighbours. The same protection. In a smaller and gentler way, was working in every household that loved its tea and kept a barrel of small beer in the cellar. Now, I do not want to overstate it, and the honest historian never does. Tea did not save everyone, and cold water was still drunk in enormous quantities. And the poorest of the poor could not always afford the fuel to boil a kettle or the leaves to fill a pot. So the protection fell unevenly and left the most vulnerable most exposed. Historians still argue about just how large a part the national habit of tea drinking played in the general improvement of health across the century, with some giving it real weight and others cautioning that it is hard to untangle from all the other changes happening at once. But the underlying fact is not in doubt. Boiling water makes it safe. Tea requires boiling water. The Victorians drank oceans of tea, and so the beloved national ritual of the teapot was, among all its other comforts, a quiet and continuous act of public health, performed millions of times a day by people who thought they were merely having a nice sit-down and a cup of something warm. There is a lovely quirky tidbit tucked inside this, which is that the very language of the age hints at the buried wisdom. People spoke of a cup of tea as reviving, restorative, as putting the heart back into you, as being just the thing when you felt low or peaky or out of sorts, and while much of that was the simple comfort of warmth and ritual and a moment's rest, some part of it surely was the real and repeated experience that people who drank their tea tended to keep better health than people who gulped cold water from a doubtful source. The body learns what is good for it long before the mind can explain why, and a culture, which is only a great many bodies remembering together, can hold on to a life-saving habit for centuries while telling itself all sorts of charming and mistaken stories about the reason for it. And you can watch the same instinct at work in the Victorian suspicion of milk, which was, in the crowded cities, another genuinely dangerous drink, often coming from diseased cows kept in filthy urban sheds, sometimes watered down with the very contaminated water people were trying to avoid, and carrying tuberculosis and other infections into the households that trusted it. Careful families learned to scald their milk, to heat it before use. And this scalding, like the boiling of tea water, killed the germs within, decades before the process we now call pasteurization was formally invented and named after that same Louis Pasteur whose germs had inspired Lister. So once again you find the Victorians reaching, through habit and suspicion and folk wisdom, toward a truth that the science had not yet caught up to, heating their milk and boiling their tea water and protecting their children, by rituals whose real power they could not have named. Let that warm and homely image settle over you now, a kettle singing on the hob, steam rising, a family gathered around a scrub table with their cups, safe for one more day by a wisdom older and deeper than they knew. As we turn from the kitchen to the coast, and to one of the most delightful of all Victorian prescriptions, the doctor's order to go and take the sea air. Of all the rules the Victorians lived by, this is surely the most pleasant to obey, and the one you would most happily accept from your own physician. When you're run down, when your nerves are frayed, or your lungs are weak, or your child is pale and listless and will not thrive, you must go to the seaside and take the sea air. It was prescribed constantly by serious doctors for a vast range of ailments, and it built entire towns. The great Victorian seaside resorts, Brighton and Scarborough and Blackpool and Margate and 100 others, grew rich and grand on the firm medical conviction that the air of the coast, brisk and salt and bracing, was a genuine tonic for the body, and that sea bathing, the immersion of the body in cold salt water, could cure or ease everything from melancholy to consumption to the vague wasting conditions that carried off so many. The railways made it possible for ordinary people, not just the rich, to make the journey, and so on a summer weekend the trains would pour out thousands of pale city dwellers onto the beaches to breathe the healing air. And the marvellous thing, the thing that fits so perfectly into our theme, is that they were, in their innocent way, largely right. The sea air really was better for them, though not for the mystical reasons they imagined. Think about what the coast offered a Victorian escaping the city. The air was genuinely cleaner, free of the coal smoke and the industrial filth and the miasma of the crowded slums, salt and fresh and moving. The sunlight was abundant, and we have already seen how sunlight kills germs and lifts the spirit and, though they could not have known it, helps the body make the vitamin it needs for strong bones. There was rest and gentle exercise and a break from the grinding stress and foul conditions of urban labour. For a consumptive patient in particular, someone with tuberculosis, the clean fresh air and the sunshine and the rest were, before the age of antibiotics, very nearly the only things that genuinely helped, and the whole later movement of open-air sanatoria for the treatment of tuberculosis grew directly out of this Victorian faith in healing air. So the doctor who sent his patient to Brighton was, without understanding the mechanism, sending them toward real cleaner air, real sunlight, real rest, and real recovery. The rituals of the Victorian seaside are a delight to picture, and none more so than the bathing machine, that peculiar invention that captures the age so perfectly. Its earnest care for health tangled up with its equally earnest care for modesty. A bathing machine was a small wooden hut on wheels, and a bather would climb inside it fully dressed on the beach, change into a bathing costume within its privacy, and then the whole hut would be drawn down into the sea by a horse until it stood in the water, whereupon the bather could descend the steps directly into the waves, decently hidden from the eyes on the shore. The idea of dunking oneself in cold salt water was taken with great seriousness as a medical treatment, the cold shock believed to brace the nerves and tone the system. And there were even professional dippers, strong men and women who would help nervous bathers into the water and, if the treatment called for it, plunge them under. Historians still argue about how much genuine benefit all this cold water dipping conferred beyond the general good of exercise and fresh air. But the sea bathing craze filled the lungs and reddened the cheeks of a great many people who badly needed both. There is a quirky tidbit here that shows how the medical and the pleasurable blurred together, because what began as stern doctor's orders slowly became the great national holiday. The seaside was prescribed as medicine, and then people discovered that the medicine was fun, that a day at the coast was a joy in itself, and so the piers and the promenades and the ice creams and the donkey rides and the whole cheerful apparatus of the Victorian seaside holiday grew up around what had started as a health cure. It is a happy example of a rule that people were only too glad to follow, and one whose benefits, cleaner air, sunshine, rest, exercise, and simple happiness, were real whatever the theory. Not every Victorian health craze was so benign, and we will meet some genuinely dangerous ones before the night is through. But the sea air prescription stands as one of the loveliest cases of the age blundering into wisdom, sending its weary and its sickly toward the coast in search of a magical bracing vapour and finding for them instead the honest and unmagical healing of light and air and water and rest. So let this be the scene that carries you deeper towards sleep now, the long pale beach under a wide Victorian sky, the bathing machines lined up at the water's edge, the gulls turning overhead, the cool salt air moving over everyone, city clerks and tired mothers and pale children, all of them breathing something clean at last. All of them a little healthier for it, and none of them quite understanding why. And from the healing coast let us turn inland again, to the mountains and the pine forests, and to the strange and beautiful institution the Victorians built to fight the greatest killer of them all. The greatest killer of them all had a soft and almost gentle name. They called it consumption, because it seemed to consume the sufferer from within, wasting them slowly away, and we call it tuberculosis. And in the 19th century it was responsible for something like 1 death in every 4 across much of Europe. It was so common, so woven into ordinary life that it acquired a whole romantic mythology. The pale, thin consumptive with the bright feverish eyes, and the flush. On the cheek becoming grotesquely a kind of beauty ideal, the tragic wasting heroine coughing delicately into a lace handkerchief. But there was nothing beautiful about the reality of it. The slow suffocation, the endless cough, the blood, the years of decline. And against this vast and patient enemy, the Victorians, having no drug that could touch it, reached for the only weapons they had, and those weapons were, once again, air and light and rest, deployed this time not on the coast but in the mountains. In the great institutions they called sanatoria. The sanatorium was a peculiar and rather wonderful invention, a hospital that was really more of a strict outdoor health regime, usually set high in the clean cold air of the mountains or deep among the pine forests, where consumptive patients would go, sometimes for months or years, to follow a rigid program of fresh air, rest, and careful feeding. The heart of the treatment was the open-air cure, and it was taken with an almost religious seriousness. Patients were wheeled out onto broad balconies and terraces, wrapped in blankets, and left to lie for hours in the cold mountain air day after day in all weathers, breathing deep of the clean thin atmosphere, because the doctors believed, and this time they were largely right, that fresh air and rest gave the body its best chance to fight the disease. They ate rich, plentiful food to build up their wasted strength. They rested, truly rested, forbidden from exertion, their days organised around stillness and air and quiet. And a surprising number of them actually recovered, or at least improved enough to leave, because in the era before antibiotics, giving the body clean air, good food, sunlight and complete rest really was, sometimes, enough to let it win the fight on its own. We now understand tuberculosis as a bacterial infection, caused by a specific germ identified in 1882 by the great German scientist Robert Koch, whose discovery we will come to properly before the night is out, and spread through the air by the coughing of the infected. And when you understand that, the wisdom of the sanatorium becomes clear in a new way. Taking the sick out of the crowded, stuffy, germ-laden air of the cities and placing them in the open air of the mountains did two good things at once. It gave each patient the fresh air and sunlight and rest that helped their own body resist the disease, and it also removed them from the packed households and workplaces where they would have coughed the infection onto everyone around them, isolating the contagious among the pine trees where they could do no harm. The sanatorium was, without anyone quite framing it that way at first, both a treatment and a quarantine, a place of healing and a place of separation. And on both counts, it did real good. Historians still argue about exactly how effective the sanatoria truly were, how many of the recoveries were owed to the treatment, and how. Many to the simple fact that some cases of tuberculosis resolve on their own, and about whether the strict regimes were always as beneficial as their fierce advocates believed. But the broad verdict is kind to them. In an age with no cure, the open-air cure was among the best that medicine could offer, and it saved or lengthened a great many lives. And there is a quirky tidbit here that I find genuinely moving, which is that the culture of the sanatorium, all that lying still on cold balconies wrapped in blankets and staring at the mountains, produced a whole strange literature and art of its own. As patients confined for months and years turned to writing and painting and long slow thought, so that some of the reflective, still interior quality of a certain strand of European culture was born on those very balconies, in the enforced stillness of the cure. Suffering has strange fruits, and the sanatorium bore some unexpected ones. So picture it now as your own breathing slows and deepens in sympathy. A long wooden balcony high in the Alps, snow on the distant peaks, the dark green of the pine forest below, and a row of patients lying wrapped and still in their reclining chairs, faces turned to the clean cold air. Breathing slowly, resting, healing, or trying to. It is a scene of great stillness and great patience, of the human body given nothing but air and rest and time, and asked to do the rest itself, and it stands as perhaps the purest example of the whole theme of our journey. The Victorians fighting an invisible enemy with the simplest and most natural of weapons, and winning more often than you might expect. From this high, clean, quiet place, let's come back down to the crowded towns and to the harder, sterner rules the Victorians made when a disease could not be soothed with sea air or mountain rest, but had to be shut away behind walls and doors in the frightening and necessary world of quarantine, when a disease was known to leap from person to person. The Victorians reached for a rule as old as human civilization itself, and one that we have all, in recent memory, come to understand in our bones. Separate the sick from the well, shut them away, keep the healthy apart from the infected until the danger is past. This is quarantine, a word that comes from the Italian for 40, from the 40 days that ships suspected of carrying plague were once made to wait at anchor before anyone could come ashore. And by the 19th century it had grown into a whole apparatus of isolation, of fever hospitals and quarantine stations and the strict shutting up of infected houses. It could be cruel, and it could be clumsy, and it was often applied on the basis of quite mistaken ideas about how a given disease actually spread. But at its core it rested on a truth so solid that it remains one of the central tools of public health to this very day. The Victorians built special hospitals, called fever hospitals or isolation hospitals, whose entire purpose was to take people suffering from the dangerous infectious diseases, smallpox, typhus, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and remove them from their crowded homes and neighbourhoods, and keep them apart until they either recovered or died, so that they could not spread the contagion through the packed streets. A family in a tenement, where one sick child sleeping in a shared bed could infect the whole household and then the whole building, might have that child taken to the fever hospital, and while the separation was often heartbreaking, the parents perhaps unable to visit. the child frightened and alone among strangers. It genuinely slowed the spread of diseases that could otherwise race through a district like fire. When a house held a case of a notifiable disease, it might be marked, its inhabitants kept in, its bedding and belongings burned or fumigated, and though the Victorians often thought they were destroying miasma or foul, contagion in the abstract, they were in practice destroying the real germs clinging to the mattress and the blankets and the clothes. There is a genuine tension in this part of the story that the honest teller must not smooth over, because quarantine and isolation, however necessary, carried real cruelties and real injustices, and the two often fell hardest on the poor. It was the crowded slum, not the airy villa, whose children were carried off to the fever hospital, and there was a whole politics of blame in which the diseases of poverty were treated as though they were the fault of the poor themselves, their supposed dirtiness and immorality, rather than the fault of the appalling conditions in which they were forced to live. Reformers and reactionaries fought bitterly over how much to compel and how much to persuade, over whether isolation should be voluntary or forced, over the rights of the individual against the safety of the crowd, and these are arguments that, as we have all lately learned, never entirely go away, because they sit on a genuine and permanent tension between liberty and protection. Historians still argue about where the Victorians drew those lines well, and where they drew them badly, and there is no simple verdict to be had. But strip away the mistaken theories and the class prejudice and the clumsiness, and the underlying rule was sound, and it saved lives. Keeping the infectious apart from the healthy really does slow and sometimes stop an epidemic, whatever you believe about the mechanism of the disease, because it interrupts the chain by which one sick person infects the next. The Victorians understood this at the level of hard practical experience, that letting a smallpox patient walk freely through a crowded town was a way to fill the graveyards, and that shutting them away, however sad, kept others alive. And they paired it with another sound practice, the tracing and watching of contacts, the noting of who had been near the sick, so that an outbreak could be spotted and contained before it grew, which is the direct ancestor of the disease surveillance that guards us still. John Snow, with his map of the Broad Street dead, was doing a kind of this work, tracing a disease back through the people it touched. And the whole young science of epidemiology grew out of exactly this instinct, to watch how sickness moves through a population and to step in and break its path. So as you lie there, safe and warm and well, spare a thought for the harder edge of Victorian medical wisdom. The shut door and the marked house and the lonely child in the fever ward, rules born of fear and often applied unkindly, and yet resting at bottom on a truth we have all had fresh cause to respect, that a contagious disease is stopped by keeping people apart. It is the least gentle of the rules we meet tonight, and the one with the sharpest moral edges, but it belongs in our story because it too was right. Right for reasons the Victorians only half understood, and right at a terrible human cost that we should not forget even as we credit the lives it saved. Let us turn now from shutting disease out to a far more cunning and hopeful rule, the one where the Victorians learned not merely to avoid a disease, but to defeat it before it ever arrived through the strange and miraculous practice of vaccination. The rule this time is one the Victorians inherited from the very end of the previous century, and it was so strange, so counter to all intuition, that it is a wonder anyone believed it at all. To protect yourself from a deadly disease, you must deliberately give yourself a tiny, controlled dose of a milder cousin of it. To keep from dying of smallpox, the great disfiguring killer that scarred and blinded and slew across all of history, you should let a doctor scratch into your arm a little matter. Taken from the sores of cowpox, a mild disease caught from cattle. It sounds mad, and to many Victorians it seemed mad, and yet it worked. And the story of how it came to be known is one of the loveliest in all of medicine, resting on a piece of humble country wisdom that a careful doctor took seriously when his learned colleagues would have laughed. The doctor was Edward Jenner, working in rural Gloucestershire in the 1790s, just before our Victorian age proper. And the country wisdom was this: the milkmaids, everyone knew, rarely caught smallpox, and their skin stayed clear and unmarked when others were ruined by the pox. It was almost a proverb. The beauty of the milkmaid, her unblemished face, and buried in that folk observation was a profound medical truth waiting for someone to notice it. Jenner noticed. He reasoned that the milkmaids in the course of their work caught the mild cowpox from the udders of the cows, and that having had cowpox somehow protected them from the deadly smallpox, and he tested it in an experiment that would give a modern ethics board a heart attack, taking matter from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes and scratching it into the arm of a small boy, and then, once the boy had recovered from the mild cowpox, deliberately exposing him to smallpox itself, and finding that the boy did not sicken. The protection was real. He called it vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, and he had handed humanity its first true weapon against an infectious disease, decades before anyone understood germs or immunity or why on earth it should work. By the Victorian age, vaccination against smallpox had spread widely, and the government came to take it so seriously that in 1853 it passed a law making the vaccination of infants compulsory, one of the first times a state had ever ordered such a thing for the health of the whole population, and the effect over the century was dramatic. Smallpox, which had been one of the most reliable killers of children, one of the terrors of every parent, was pushed back and back, its epidemics blunted, its death toll falling, until in the following century it became the first and so far the only human disease ever to be wiped entirely from the face of the earth by deliberate effort, eradicated completely, gone. And the whole towering achievement rested at its foundation on Jenner taking seriously the clear complexions of the milkmaids, on a piece of ordinary folk knowledge that the clever might have dismissed, and following it patiently to one of the greatest discoveries in human history. Now, in the spirit of honesty that has guided us all night, we must note that the compulsory vaccination laws provoked real and passionate resistance, and that the resistance was not simply foolishness. There were genuine anti-vaccination movements in the Victorian age, and while some of their fears were mistaken, some rested on real problems. For the early vaccination could be crudely done, arm to arm from one child to another, and could occasionally carry other infections along with the cowpox. And the compulsion itself, the state reaching into the family to order a medical procedure on a baby, raised exactly the questions of liberty and authority that we saw in the matter of quarantine. Historians still argue about the balance of it, about how to weigh the enormous good of a nearly conquered smallpox against the real grievances of those who resisted being compelled. These are not easy questions, and they are with us yet. But the core of the rule, the almost unbelievable central insight, stands as one of the great triumphs of the age, that you could teach the body to defend itself against a killer by showing it a harmless cousin first. And what makes it fit so beautifully into our theme is that the Victorians, once again, were doing something that genuinely worked long before they could explain why it worked. They had no theory of the immune system, no understanding of antibodies or memory cells or any of the elegant machinery we now know the body uses to remember an enemy and destroy it on sight. They simply knew, from Jenner's careful work and from mountains of accumulated experience, that vaccination protected against smallpox, and so they did it, scratching the cowpox into the arms of their infants on the strength of a result they could not account for, and saving countless lives thereby. It is perhaps the purest example of all, a rule that was not merely right by accident, but right in the deepest and most powerful way, reaching forward across a whole century to hand the future a world without smallpox at all. Hold that hopeful thought as you drift. The clear-skinned milkmaids and the country doctor who believed them, and let us turn now to another borrowed piece of wisdom, this one carried back from distant tropical forests. In the bitter bark that cured the fever of the marshes. Follow me now away from the cold and crowded cities to the low, wet, marshy places of the world, the fens and the swamps and the tropical river deltas, where a particular fever had haunted humankind since the beginning, a fever that came and went in shivering fits, burning hot and then freezing cold, returning again and again to rack the body, and that killed on a vast scale across the warm and watery regions of the earth. In England they called it the Ugh, and it lurked in the marshy districts of places like the Fens and the Essex coast. And across the tropical empire it was one of the greatest killers of soldiers and settlers and native peoples alike. We call it malaria now, and the name itself, from the Italian for bad air, tells you exactly what everyone believed for most of history, that it rose, like so much else, from the foul vapours of the swamp. And once again the wrong theory sat right next to a right practice. Because while the bad air idea was mistaken, the Victorians possessed and used a genuine and powerful remedy against the fever, a bitter medicine drawn from the bark of a tree that grew half a world away. The tree was the cinchona, native to the high forests of the Andes in South America, and the indigenous peoples of those mountains had long known that its bark could ease fevers. The knowledge travelled to Europe, and by the Victorian age the active substance had been extracted and purified and given a name, quinine, a bitter white powder that really did fight the malarial fever, genuinely attacking the parasite that caused it. Though of course no one yet knew there was a parasite to attack. Quinine worked. It was not a perfect cure, and it had unpleasant effects of its own, but it could break the fever and save the life, and it became one of the most valuable medicines in the world. So valuable that control of the cinchona supply was a matter of empires, and the ability to keep soldiers and administrators alive in the malarial. Tropics with regular doses of quinine was quite literally one of the things that allowed the European empires to spread into regions that had previously been deadly to outsiders. A bitter bark from a Peruvian tree reshaped the map of the world, and here comes one of the most delightful quirky tidbits in all of our journey. Because the extreme bitterness of quinine led by a wonderfully roundabout path to a drink that sits on shelves and bar counters everywhere to this day. To make the daily dose of quinine more palatable, people in the tropical colonies took to dissolving it in soda water with a little sugar, creating what became known as tonic water, and then, this being a very human sort of story, they found that a measure of gin made the bitter medicine go down even more agreeably, and so was born the gin and tonic which began its life, believe it or not, as a way of taking one's anti-malarial medicine. Every gin and tonic ever poured is a distant descendant of a Victorian health rule, the faint bitterness of the tonic water a ghost of the quinine, that once fought the fevers of empire. Historians still argue about how much protection the actual quinine content of modern tonic water could ever provide. And the honest answer is almost none. It is far too weak. But the origin is real, and it is a charming reminder of how deeply these old medical rules are woven into the ordinary pleasures we never think to question. The mistaken bad air theory, meanwhile, though wrong about the cause, once again nudged people towards some genuinely useful behaviour. Because avoiding the marshes at night, draining the swamps, and staying away from the stagnant waters where the fever seemed to breed all happened, by pure good fortune, to reduce exposure to the true culprit, the mosquito which bred in exactly those stagnant waters and bit in exactly those night hours. The drainage of marshland, undertaken to banish the poisonous vapours, destroyed the breeding grounds of the mosquito and drove back the fever. Right practice from wrong theory yet again. The same pattern we have traced all night long. It would not be until the very end of the Victorian age. And just beyond that, the true story was finally uncovered, that a tiny parasite carried by a biting mosquito was the real cause of the fever, a discovery that would earn its makers the highest honours of science. But by then the Victorians had already spent a century fighting the disease effectively with quinine and drainage, winning real victories against an enemy whose true nature they had entirely misunderstood. So let the fever cool and the Fenland mist settle as you sink deeper towards sleep and hold the strange chain of it in your mind, the bark of an Andean tree carried across the world to break. A fever in an Essex marsh, the bitter medicine softened into a summer drink, the swamps drained to banish a vapour and defeating a mosquito instead. It is all of a piece with everything we have seen tonight, the Victorians reaching out with the wrong hand and grasping so often the right thing. And from the bitter bark and the marsh fever, let us return to the town and to a rule about the simplest and most human act of all. The act of getting clean, and the great public palaces the Victorians built so that even the poorest among them could wash. There is an old saying, much loved by the Victorians, that cleanliness is next to godliness, and though it was preached as a moral and religious sentiment, a matter of decency and self-respect, it turned out to carry within it a solid core of medical truth that the preachers could not have fully explained. To be clean, to wash the body and the clothes and the home, really did protect against disease by removing the germs and the lice and the fleas that carried so much sickness. And the Victorian obsession with cleanliness, however tangled up it was with class snobbery and religious moralising, did real good for the health of the nation. But there was a cruel problem at the heart of it, which was that for the poorest of the poor, crammed into tenements with no running water, no bath, sometimes a single tap or pump shared by a whole crowded street, Being clean was very nearly impossible, however much they might wish it. And so the reformers of the age set out to do something genuinely admirable about it. They built public baths. In 1846, Parliament passed an act to encourage the building of public baths and washhouses, and across the industrial towns and cities there rose these remarkable institutions. Great public buildings where, for a small coin or sometimes for nothing at all, a working man or woman could come and have a proper hot bath. And where, just as importantly, they could bring the family washing and use the hot water and the tubs and the drying rooms to launder clothes and bedding that could never have been properly cleaned in a cramped tenement room. It is easy to overlook how much this mattered, in a world where the poor might otherwise wear the same unwashed. Clothes for weeks and sleep in bedding that harboured lice and fleas and the diseases they carried, giving them access to hot water and soap was a real and substantial gift of health, and the washhouses in particular, where the household linen could be boiled clean, were quietly striking at the fleas and lice that spread typhus. One of the great killers of the slums, boiling the laundry killed the vermin and their diseases, though the women bent over the steaming tubs thought only that they were getting the clothes clean and respectable. Soap itself became, over the Victorian century, something close to a symbol of the age, mass-produced, heavily advertised, pressed upon the population as both a moral and a practical duty, and while the advertising was often absurd and the moralising often smug, the underlying message, wash with soap and water, was sound. Soap does not merely make you smell pleasant, it genuinely lifts the germs and dirt from the skin and carries them away. And a population that washed its hands and bodies and clothes with soap was a healthier population, less prone to the skin infections and the fevers and the parasites that thrived on the unwashed. The Victorians did not understand the microbiology of it, that the soap molecule tears apart the outer coats of many germs and floats them away on the rinse water, but they had learned from long experience that the clean fared better than the filthy, and they built an entire culture around that truth, from the grand public baths to the humble bar of soap by the kitchen sink. There is a genuine tension to acknowledge here, as always, because the Victorian gospel of cleanliness had an ugly side, a tendency to treat the dirt of the poor as a moral failing rather than a consequence of poverty, to look down upon the unwashed as though they had chosen their filth, when in truth they had been given no means to escape it. The same reformers who built the noble public baths could also preach a cruel and self-satisfied sermon that blamed the victims of the slums for the very conditions imposed upon them. Historians still argue about how to weigh the real practical good of the sanitary and cleanliness movements against the class contempt so often mixed into them, and it is right to hold both truths at once, the genuine lives saved and the genuine injustice done. But the practical rule, wash, keep clean, was among the soundest they had, and the public baths stand as one of the more purely admirable monuments of the age, buildings raised on the simple, decent and entirely correct idea that everyone, however poor, deserved the means to be clean. So picture, as your thoughts grow slow and warm, one of those great Victorian bathhouses on a winter evening, the steam rising in the gaslight, the rows of tubs, the working men soaking away the grime of the factory and the working women wringing out the family wash in the great hot troughs, everyone a little cleaner and a little safer for it. The lice and the fevers driven back by nothing more than hot water and soap, and the stubborn Victorian faith that to be clean was to be well. It is a homely and a hopeful image, and it belongs among the best of what the age achieved. But not every Victorian rule about the home was so wholesome, and now we must turn to a darker corner, to a danger that lurked, quite literally, in the walls of the Victorian house, in the very colour of its wallpaper, where a beautiful and fashionable green concealed a genuine and creeping poison, and where the nervous advice to beware of certain rooms turned out to rest on a truth more sinister than anyone at first suspected. The colour was green, a particular vivid, luscious, emerald green that the Victorians adored, and it was everywhere, in the wallpaper that lined their parlours, in the fabric of their dresses, in the artificial leaves of the flowers on a lady's hat, even, horrifyingly, in the colouring of some sweets and cakes. It was called by various names, Shields green and Paris green and emerald green, and it was so rich and so bright and so unlike the dull, muddy greens that older dyes could produce that fashionable society could not get enough of it. There was only one problem, and it was a serious one. The pigment that produced that gorgeous green was made with arsenic, one of the deadliest poisons known to humanity, and the Victorians were papering their walls and dressing their bodies and, in the worst cases, decorating their food with a substance that could sicken and kill. For a long time, the danger was not understood, but as the century wore on, a growing number of doctors and observers began to notice a disturbing pattern that people who lived in rooms papered in the fashionable green often fell mysteriously ill, suffering headaches and stomach troubles and a slow wasting sickness, and that children in particular sometimes sickened and died in bright green nurseries for no cause anyone could name. Careful investigators came to suspect the wallpaper itself, and eventually the mechanism was understood, at least in part. In damp conditions, and Victorian rooms were very often damp, certain moulds could grow on the arsenic-laden wallpaper and act upon the pigment, releasing a poisonous arsenic gas into the air of the room. A slow, invisible vapour that the inhabitants breathed night after night as they slept and sat and lived in their beautiful poisoned parlours. Flakes and dust from the paper could also be swallowed or breathed, and the dresses dyed with the green could shed poisonous powder onto the skin and into the air of the ballroom. The very fashionableness of the colour was quietly making people ill, and so there arose in the later Victorian decades a genuine public alarm about arsenic in the home, and with it a body of nervous advice that sounds, to modern ears, almost superstitious, warnings to beware of green rooms, to strip out the green wallpaper, to distrust the fashionable emerald shades, and this time the fearful advice was not merely accidentally right, but directly, straightforwardly correct. The green really was dangerous. The rooms really could poison you. Stripping out the arsenical wallpaper really did protect the household. It is a fascinating reversal of our usual pattern tonight, because here the Victorians for once correctly identified both the danger and roughly its cause, and the folk wisdom that grew up around avoiding the poisoned green was sound in every particular. There is even a famous and much argued story that the great designer William Morris, whose beautiful wallpapers helped define the age and whose family fortune came, in part from a company that mined and used arsenic, was for a long time reluctant to accept that his gorgeous green papers could be harming anyone, insisting the fears were overblown. A reminder that even the most creative and progressive minds can be slow to see a danger woven into their own success. The wider lesson of the arsenic green is a sobering one, and it forms an important counterweight to the cosier stories we have told tonight, because it reminds us that the Victorian home was full of genuine, hidden dangers that had nothing to do with germs at all, poisons and toxins woven into the very fabric of fashionable life. It was not only the wallpaper. Arsenic and other poisons found their way into cosmetics that women smeared on their faces to achieve a fashionable pallor, into cheap food adulterated by unscrupulous sellers, into the bright colours of children's toys and cards and artificial flowers. The Victorians lived surrounded by chemical hazards that they only gradually came to recognise and regulate, and the slow, hard-won campaigns to get the arsenic out of the wallpaper and the poisons out of the food and cosmetics were among the earliest battles. Of what we would now call consumer protection, the dawning idea that the things people bought and brought into their homes ought to be tested and made safe. Historians still argue about how many deaths the arsenical greens truly caused, with estimates ranging widely and some cases hard to prove at this distance. But that the danger was real, and that the fear of it was justified, is not in serious doubt. So let the beautiful poisoned green fade from the walls of your imagination as you drift, a warning as much as a wonder, a reminder that not every danger comes from filth and germs, and that the Victorians, for all their blundering wisdom about air and water and cleanliness, also had to learn, slowly and at great cost, to fear the very colours and comforts they loved. And from the poisoned parlour let us step out into the working world of the age, into the factories and the chimneys and the matchworks, where a different kind of hidden danger stalked the men and women and children who laboured, and where the hard rules of survival were written. Once again, in sickness and in early death, and slowly, painfully, understood. Consider first the chimney sweeps, and in particular the small boys, the climbing boys, who were sent up inside the narrow flues of the Victorian chimneys to scrape and brush away the soot, a trade so cruel that it has become a byword for the harshness of the age. These children, some of them very young, spent their days crawling through tight, dark, filthy passages, coming out coated head to foot in black soot that worked its way into every fold and crease of their skin, and a careful surgeon had noticed, back in the previous century, a terrible pattern among them. That as they grew older, the sweeps suffered from a particular cancer at a rate far beyond other men. His name was Percival Pott, and his observation, made in 1775, just before our period, is often called the first identification of an occupational cancer in history, the first time anyone had clearly linked a specific job to a specific disease caused by something in the work itself. He reasoned that the soot, lodged in the skin and never properly washed away, was the cause, and in this he was exactly right, for we now know that soot is rich in the chemical compounds that can trigger cancer. And here is where the rule enters, simple and sound and heartbreaking, and how easily it might have spared so much suffering: wash. If the sweeps had been able to bathe regularly and thoroughly, to scrub the soot from their skin at the end of each day rather than letting it grind in week after week, the disease would have been far rarer. And where such washing was practiced, the difference could be seen. In some places, the sweeps were more careful about cleanliness than in others, and the disease tracked the difference. It was one of the earliest glimmerings of the whole idea of occupational health, the recognition that a trade could carry a specific danger, and that specific measures, washing, protection, changed practices, could guard against it. That children were sent up the chimneys at all is one of the genuine horrors of the age, and it took decades of campaigning and a series of laws to finally end the use of climbing boys. But the medical insight that came out of their suffering, that the soot of their trade gave them cancer and that cleanliness could prevent it, was a real and important step in learning to protect workers from the hazards of their work. Turn now to the match factories, and to the young women and girls who worked in them, the match girls whose plight became one of the famous causes of the later Victorian age. The matches of the time were made with white phosphorus, a substance that glowed and caught fire easily and made a fine match. But that was also a slow and dreadful poison to those who worked with it day after day in the fumes of the factory. The phosphorus attacked the bones of the jaw, causing a horrifying condition the workers called phossy jaw, in which the jawbone itself would begin to rot and die, glowing faintly in the dark, obsessing and disfiguring and sometimes killing the sufferer, an affliction of almost gothic awfulness that fell upon young women for the crime of earning their bread. The rule that could have prevented it was, in principle, straightforward: to improve the ventilation of the factories, to keep the workers from breathing the fumes, to insist on cleanliness so that the poison was not carried from hand to mouth, and ultimately to stop using the deadly white phosphorus altogether in favour of a safer kind that did not rot the bones. The story of the match girls became famous because in 1888 the young women of a great London match factory, Bryant and May, went on strike over their appalling conditions and their poisonous work, and their courage drew the attention of the whole nation to what was being done to them, and helped push forward the slow movement towards safer factories and safer materials. It is a story that shows the other side of these medical rules, the side that was not about individual behaviour, not about opening a window or washing your hands, but about power and money and the refusal of those who profited. From dangerous work to make it safe until they were forced to. The knowledge of how to prevent phossy jaw existed. The safer phosphorus existed. What was lacking was the will to spend the money and change the practice, and it took the strike of the workers themselves and years of public pressure to bring that change about. Historians still argue about the precise mix of forces that finally ended the use of white phosphorus: the strikes, the campaigners, the changing law, the shifting economics. But the human truth of it is plain enough, that the rule to protect the workers was known long before it was obeyed. So as you rest there, warm and safe and far from any chimney or match works, hold a gentle thought for the climbing boys black with soot and the match girls with their glowing ruined jaws, and for the hard, slow, painful way that the age learned to see the dangers hidden in honest work, and to make rules against them. It is the sterner, sadder end of our subject, where the wisdom came not from folk habit or lucky accident, but from suffering carefully observed and injustice bravely resisted, and where the right rule, once found, still had to fight for years against those who found it cheaper to look away. From the factory floor, let us return to the table, and to the food itself, and to the Victorian rules about eating and drinking, some foolish, some wise, and some, once again, right for reasons no one at the table could have guessed. The Victorian relationship with food was a tangle of sound instinct, anxious superstition, and genuine, well-founded fear, and to understand it you must first grasp a grim fact about the age, which is that the food and drink sold to ordinary people was very often not what it claimed to be, and was sometimes downright dangerous. This was the great era of food adulteration, when unscrupulous sellers, chasing profit in a market with almost no regulation, mixed all manner of cheap and nasty and sometimes poisonous substances into the food they sold. Bread was whitened with alum and even on occasion adulterated with chalk or worse. Milk was watered down, sometimes with dirty water, and tinted to look richer. Tea leaves were mixed with dried and coloured leaves of other plants. Sweets were coloured with the very same arsenic and other metal-based dyes that made the wallpaper so deadly, so that a child's treat could carry a real poison. Beer and wine were doctored, spices were bulked out with dust and sweepings, and the poor, who had the least money and the least power, were cheated and endangered the most. Against this background, a good deal of Victorian caution about food, which might otherwise seem merely fussy, takes on a rational edge. To be suspicious of cheap food from a doubtful source, to prefer what you could see prepared or grow yourself, to distrust the too bright colour and the too good bargain, was sensible in a world where the food supply was so often corrupted, and the slow campaign to expose and outlaw food adulteration, led by crusading chemists and doctors who analysed samples and published what they found, was another of the early battles of consumer protection. Running alongside the fight against arsenic in the wallpaper, and leading eventually to the first real laws requiring that food be what it claimed to be, and free of poison. The Victorians had to learn the hard way that the marketplace would not police itself, and that the safety of the food on the table was a matter for public rules and public vigilance, a lesson that had to be written, as so many were, in sickness and scandal before it was accepted. Then there were the rules about what and when to eat in sickness, and here the Victorians inherited a great store of folk sayings, some sound and some silly, of which the most famous is surely the old adage to feed a cold and starve a fever. It is the kind of homely rule that gets passed down through generations, and people still half remember it today, and the truth of it is genuinely mixed. There is a sliver of sense in the idea that different illnesses call for different care, that a feverish patient may have little appetite and should not be forced, while someone fighting off a chill may benefit from warmth and nourishment. But taken as a strict command, it can do real harm, for a sick body usually needs fluids and gentle nourishment to fight its battle. And to truly starve a fever is bad advice. It stands as an example of the other kind of Victorian rule, not the wisdom accidentally right, but the folk saying only half right, passed on with confidence and obeyed without examination, and it is worth including precisely because it reminds us that not every old rule hides a buried truth. Some are just old, but the food rule that fits our theme most beautifully concerns the summer, and fruit, and the dreaded cholera season. The Victorians noticed correctly that outbreaks of the deadly summer diarrhea and of cholera itself tended to come in the hot months, and they developed a strong body of anxious advice about avoiding certain foods in summer. Being wary of unripe or overripe fruit, of food that had sat too long in the heat, of anything that seemed spoiled or off. They explained it, as they explained everything, with their theories of bad air and disordered humours and the general unhealthiness of the season, and they were wrong about the mechanism. But the practice was sound, because in a world without refrigeration, food really did spoil quickly in the summer heat, breeding exactly the germs that caused the deadly summer sickness. And contaminated fruit and food really were a route by which cholera and dysentery spread. To be careful about summer food, to avoid what was spoiled or suspect, to distrust the fruit that had sat too long in the sun was to avoid, without knowing it, a genuine seasonal peak of dangerous germs. Right practice. Wrong theory. One final time. The pattern that has run like a golden thread through everything we have touched tonight. So let the table be cleared and the kitchen grow quiet as your own thoughts begin to still and carry with you this last image of the Victorians at their food, hedged about with rules both wise and foolish, cheated by their sellers and guarded by their instincts, avoiding the summer fruit and distrusting the too bright sweet, muddling their way, as they did in everything, toward a safety they could feel but not explain. We have wandered now through a great many of their rules, the wise and the strange and the sad, and before we begin the slow descent into sleep, there are just a few more corners of this world to visit, beginning with the rules that were genuinely, dangerously wrong, so that we may hold them up against all the accidental wisdom and see the whole picture clearly. To truly appreciate how often the Victorians blundered into wisdom, we must spend a little while with the rules they got genuinely, dangerously wrong, because the contrast throws all that accidental rightness into sharper relief. And because there is a strange comfort, as you lie there safe in the present, in remembering how far we have come. The first and grandest of the bad ideas was bloodletting, the ancient and revered practice of deliberately draining blood from a sick person in the belief that it would rebalance the body and drive out disease. It had been practiced for thousands of years, defended by the greatest medical authorities of history, and by the Victorian age it was still widely used, whether by the lancet that opened a vein, or by the leeches that were applied to the skin in their squirming dozens to suck the patient's blood. The theory held that illness came from an excess or imbalance of the body's fluids, its humours, and that removing blood would restore the balance and cure the fever. It was, of course, almost entirely harmful. The sick person, weakened by disease, is very nearly the last person on earth who should be further weakened by the loss of their blood. And countless patients were bled into exhaustion, into collapse, and sometimes into the grave, their strength drained away at the very moment they most needed it to fight. The demand for leeches was so great that they were harvested nearly to extinction in some regions and became a valuable article of trade. And the image of the leech jar on the physician's shelf became one of the emblems of the age. Slowly, over the century, careful doctors began to gather evidence that bloodletting did not help and often harmed, that patients left unbled frequently did better than those subjected to the lancet. And the practice went into a long decline, but it took a very long time to die. So deeply was it woven into the authority and tradition of medicine. It stands as the great cautionary tale, the confident, ancient, universally respected treatment that was worse than doing nothing at all. The second great error was the love affair with mercury, that shining liquid metal which the Victorians dosed their patients with in various forms, most commonly a compound called calomel, prescribed for an enormous range of complaints, from fevers to digestive troubles to the diseases of children. Mercury is a poison, a cumulative one that builds up in the body and attacks the nerves and the gums and the whole system, and the heavy dosing that was so common could produce dreadful effects: loosened teeth, ruined gums, trembling, and the slow damage of chronic poisoning, all inflicted in the name of cure. Patients were sometimes dosed with mercury until they showed the very signs of mercury poisoning, which the doctors, in a horrible circular logic, took as a sign that the medicine was working. It is a grim example of a treatment whose harms were mistaken for benefits. The mirror image of the accidental wisdom we have celebrated, confident error where the others found accidental truth, and the third and saddest of the bad rules concerned the babies. For the Victorians had a terrible habit of dosing their infants and small children with preparations of opium to keep them quiet, to soothe their crying, to help them sleep, and to pacify the babies of working mothers who had to leave them in the care of others while they laboured. These soothing syrups and cordials, sold under gentle, comforting names and available freely from any chemist, contained real opium in the form of laudanum. And they did indeed quiet the child, sometimes permanently, for they suppressed the appetite and the breathing, and an unknown but surely large number of infants were sickened, stunted or killed by the very medicines given to comfort them. It was not cruelty, for the most part, but ignorance and desperation, mothers and nurses with no idea of the danger, reaching for the only thing that would quiet a distressed and hungry child in an age of impossible hardship, and it stands as one of the quiet tragedies of the century. A bad rule obeyed out of love and exhaustion, with heartbreaking results. I dwell on these dark errors not to frighten you as you drift towards sleep, but to complete the picture, because the wonder of the Victorian age is precisely that it held both things at once: the confident poisons and the accidental cures, the bleeding and the leeches alongside the open windows and the boiled water, the mercury and the opium alongside the vaccination and the clean hands. The same society, sometimes the very same doctor, could be draining a fever patient of the blood he needed while also, in the next street, tearing down a slum and building a sewer that would save 10,000 lives. It was an age groping in near-total darkness, and what is astonishing is not that it stumbled so often, but that it stumbled forward so far that out of all that error and guesswork and superstition, came the foundations of modern public health, modern nursing, modern surgery, and the germ theory that would at last explain it all. Hold that balance in your mind as your breathing slows, the darkness and the light together. And let us turn now to a gentler matter, to the rules the Victorians made about the body itself, about how it should be dressed and moved and cared for, where fashion and health waged a long and curious war. The war between fashion and health in the Victorian age was fought most fiercely over a single garment, the corset, that tightly laced undergarment which shaped the female figure to the dramatic hourglass the age admired, and which became the subject of one of the great health debates of the century. Doctors and reformers warned with real concern that tight lacing the corset could do genuine harm to the body, compressing the organs, restricting the breathing, weakening the muscles of the back, and interfering with the natural workings of the body. And there was truth in these warnings, for a corset laced to its most extreme could indeed deform the ribcage over time and make it hard to draw a full breath. The medical case against tight lacing was one of the earliest sustained arguments, that the demands of fashion should give way to the needs of health, that a woman ought not to damage her body for the sake of a silhouette. And it fed into a broader movement for what was called rational dress, sensible clothing that allowed the body to move and breathe and function as it was meant to. The honest historian must add, as always, a note of complication, because the debate was tangled up with the anxieties and prejudices of the age about women and their proper place, and some of the medical warnings against the corset shaded into a more general and less reliable set of claims about female frailty and the dangers of women exerting themselves. The same medical culture that rightly warned against crushing the ribs could also wrongly insist that women were too delicate for education or exercise, or serious work, and it is not always easy, reading the old warnings to separate the sound physiology from the social prejudice. Historians still argue vigorously about how harmful corsets truly were in ordinary practice, as opposed to the rare extremes of tight lacing, and about how much the campaign against them was genuine health concern, and how much a proxy for other arguments about womanhood and freedom. But out of it all came a real and valuable idea that clothing should serve the body rather than deform it, and that health mattered more than the cruel dictates of fashion. Hand in hand with the argument for rational dress came a growing Victorian enthusiasm for exercise and physical activity, another rule that we now know to be thoroughly sound. The age developed a real cult of healthful exercise, of walking and gymnastics and calisthenics, and, as the century went on, cycling and swimming and organised games and sport, all promoted with the conviction that vigorous movement in the fresh air was good for the body and the spirits alike, and in this they were entirely right, for we now understand better than ever how deeply the body needs movement to stay well, how exercise strengthens the heart and the lungs and the muscles and the bones and lifts the mood and lengthens the life. The Victorian gentleman striding out for his daily constitutional walk, the young people taking up the new craze for the bicycle, the schools introducing physical drill and games, were all obeying a rule that modern medicine endorses with its whole heart, that a body in motion is a body in health. There was even, in this enthusiasm for exercise, a small liberation woven in, for the bicycle in particular, which became wildly popular in the later Victorian years, gave many people, and young women especially, a new freedom of movement and independence that had real social consequences, letting them travel and explore and escape the close confinement of the home in a way that had not been possible before, and the practical clothing that cycling required helped push forward the very rational dress that the reformers had argued for. So the health rule and the social change reinforced one another, the good of exercise and the good of freedom arriving together on two wheels, and it is a cheerful thread to follow through the sometimes grim landscape of Victorian medicine, a reminder that not every rule was born of fear and death, and that some grew out of a genuine and joyful discovery of what the body could do when it was allowed to move. So let the picture soften and slow as your own body settles deeper into rest. The Victorian cyclists wheeling along a country lane in the late afternoon light, the walkers striding over the hills, the young people at their games, all of them moving and breathing and growing stronger, obeying without needing any theory at all. The oldest and soundest health rule there is, that the body is made to be used. We have nearly reached the end of our long, slow catalogue of rules now. The wise and the foolish, the accidental and the hard-won, and there remains just one more cluster of them to visit, the small everyday customs of contagion and courtesy, The handkerchiefs and the covered coughs and the quiet rituals by which the Victorians, without quite knowing it, kept their germs to themselves. And after that, we will let the great revelation arrive at last, the discovery that made sense of everything, and then we will begin gently to say goodnight. The small everyday customs of the Victorian age are, in some ways, the most charming of all the rules we have met, because they were so ordinary, so woven into the texture of daily manners that hardly anyone thought of them as medicine at all, and yet a surprising number of them worked to slow the spread of disease from one person to another. Take the humble handkerchief, that square of cloth which every respectable Victorian carried and which good manners required be used to cover the mouth and nose when one coughed or sneezed. It was taught as a matter of politeness, of decency, of not spraying one's neighbours with the evidence of one's cold, but of course covering a cough or a sneeze is precisely how. We now know to slow the spread of the respiratory diseases that travel in those very sprays of droplets, and so the Victorian rule of manners was also, quietly, a rule of public health drilled into every child in the name of courtesy, and working all the while in the name of survival. Consider, too, the growing Victorian carefulness about the sharing of cups and utensils and personal things, a carefulness that increased as the century wore on, and the vague sense of contagion sharpened so that it came to seem improper and unwise to drink from another's cup or use another's spoon or share the intimate objects of the body, particularly with the sick. Again it was framed partly as a matter of refinement and propriety, but again it struck at a real root of infection. For many diseases do pass by way of shared vessels and shared spoons and the small careless intimacies of the crowded household. The rules of Victorian respectability, so easy to mock as fussy and cold, were in this respect doing genuine protective work, building small walls against the passage of germs through the very habits of daily life, and teaching a whole society, in the language of etiquette, the beginnings of infection control. There is a quirky tidbit here so delightful that I have saved it for near the end, and it concerns the Victorian beard. For a stretch of the mid-century there was a genuine medical enthusiasm for the beard as a health measure, an argument advanced in all seriousness that a man's beard served as a kind of natural filter or respirator, trapping the dust and the foul particles and the miasmatic matter of the polluted city air before they could be drawn into the lungs, and that a full beard was therefore a positive protection for the health of the working man, especially in dusty and dirty trades. It became one of several arguments in favour of the great Victorian beard, that magnificent facial foliage we associate so strongly with the age, and while the reasoning was largely fanciful, there is a small grain of truth in it. For facial hair can indeed trap some quantity of dust and particles, and the idea that the air of the industrial city was worth filtering was sound enough. Historians still argue about how seriously the beard as respirator argument was really taken as against the fashions and the practicalities that drove the beard craze. But it stands as a perfect little emblem of the age, a health rule wrapped around a fashion, half science and half whimsy, and thoroughly wonderfully Victorian. Even the elaborate Victorian customs of mourning and the treatment of the dead, so famous for their black crape and their long years of prescribed grief, carried within them some threads of practical wisdom about contagion, for the handling of the dead body, particularly the body of one who had died of an infectious disease, was hedged about with rituals and cautions that, whatever their origin in religion and custom and the deep human need to honour the dead, also served in some measure to limit the spread of the diseases that could linger about a corpse. The quarantining instinct, the sense that death and sickness required a careful, ritualized, somewhat separated handling, ran through the mourning customs as it ran through the fever hospitals, and while much of Victorian mourning was purely a matter of feeling and fashion and social display, some of its carefulness had a protective edge that no one needed to name. So as we gather up the last of the everyday rules, the covered cough and the private cup and the filtering beard and the careful handling of the dead, let them remind you that the wisdom of the age was not only in its great reforms, its sewers and its vaccinations and its hospitals, but also in the smallest textures of daily life, in manners and customs and habits so ordinary that they passed unnoticed, and that these too, taught as courtesy and obeyed as respectability, were part of the vast, blind, stumbling, largely successful effort of a whole society to keep itself alive in an age of invisible enemies. And now, with all the rules laid out before us, the wise and the foolish, the grand and the humble, we come at last to the moment when the invisible enemies were finally seen, when the whole confused and accidental wisdom of the century was suddenly explained, and the world of medicine changed forever. Let the revelation arrive gently, as your eyes grow heavy and the room grows soft in the story of the men who finally saw the germs. For all the long century of accidental wisdom we have traced tonight, the great mystery remained unsolved almost to the end, the simple question of why. Why did clean water save lives and foul water take them? Why did an open window heal and a sealed sick room kill? Why did clean hands protect the labouring mother and dirty hands destroy her? The Victorians had 1,000 rules that worked, and not one true explanation of why they worked, only the mistaken old theory of miasma and bad air, stretched further and further to cover facts it could not really hold. And then, in the second half of the century, the answer arrived, not in a single flash, but in the patient. Brilliant work of a handful of scientists who finally proved, beyond any argument, that disease was caused by living things too small to see, by germs, by microbes, by specific organisms that invaded the body and multiplied and spread from person to person, and that each disease had its own particular germ. This was the germ theory of disease, and it is one of the greatest ideas in the history of the human mind. The first of the great figures was the Frenchman Louis Pasteur, whose work we have already met glancing off the story of Lister, for it was Pasteur who showed that the souring and rotting of food and drink were caused not by the air itself but by living microorganisms carried in it, and who went on to demonstrate that these same kinds of tiny organisms could cause disease in animals and in people. He proved that germs did not arise spontaneously out of nothing, as many had believed, but came from other germs, floating in the air, settling on surfaces, passing from the sick to the well, and he developed ways to kill them with heat. The gentle heating of liquids that we still call pasteurization in his honour, the very process that made milk safe and that the careful Victorian housewife had been approximating all along when she scalded her milk over the fire. Pasteur gave the world the fundamental insight that the enemy was alive, and that it could be fought and killed and guarded against, not as a vague vapour but as a real and specific foe. The second great figure was the German Robert Koch, a country doctor of extraordinary patience and precision, who took the germ theory from a general idea to a rigorous science by proving, for one disease after another, exactly which specific germ was responsible. It was Koch who identified the germ that caused tuberculosis, the great consumptive killer, announcing his discovery in 1882 to a stunned scientific world. And Koch who tracked down the germ that caused cholera, the very disease that John Snow had traced to the Broad Street pump decades before without ever being able to see the culprit. Koch developed careful methods for growing germs and studying them and proving their guilt, a set of rigorous rules for linking a particular microbe to a particular disease. And with those methods the hidden world of the germ was opened up at last, disease by disease, until the invisible enemies that had haunted humanity forever were dragged one by one into the light of the microscope and named. And here is the moment that ties our whole night together, the moment of vindication. For once the germ theory was established. All those strange old Victorian rules suddenly made a new and perfect sense, every one of them explained at last. Why did John Snow's clean water save lives? Because the cholera germ travelled in the fouled water. Why did the open window heal? Because moving air swept away the airborne germs. Why did Semmelweis and Lister triumph with their clean hands and their carbolic acid? Because they were killing the germs before they could reach the wound and the mother. Why did boiling the water and scalding the milk protect the household? Because the heat killed the germs within. Why did quarantine and isolation slow the epidemics? Because they broke the chain by which the germs passed from the sick to the well. Every accidental piece of wisdom, every rule that worked for reasons no one understood, was suddenly illuminated, revealed as a blow struck against the germ. And the whole blind, stumbling, century-long effort was shown to have been, all along, a real and coherent war against a real and specific enemy. It is a deeply satisfying thing, this late arrival of the truth, this moment when the scattered rules snap into focus and the pattern is finally seen. And it is the perfect note on which to begin our descent into sleep, because it means that the story of Victorian medicine is not, in the end, a story of foolishness and error, though there was plenty of both, but a story of a society groping its way toward a truth it could not yet see, and getting so very much of it right by feel and by habit and by stubborn, careful observation, until at last the science caught up and explained the wisdom they had been living by all along. The Victorians built the house of modern health in the dark, and Pasteur and Koch simply turned on the lights and showed that the house was, against all odds, soundly and beautifully built. And now, with the lights on and the enemy named and the long journey nearly done, let us begin softly and slowly to say good night. So here we are, at the end of our long, slow walk through the strange and human world of Victorian medicine, and before we let the night fully take you, let us gather up together. One last gentle time, the great soft lesson of everything we have wandered through. We began at a water pump in Soho with a quiet doctor and his map, and we have travelled from there through the great stinking city and its new-built sewers, out to the bracing seaside and up into the clean mountain air, into the operating theatre and the fever ward and the public bathhouse, past the poisoned green wallpaper and the sooty chimneys and the humble singing kettle. And everywhere we went, we found the same tender, surprising truth waiting for us. These people, our great-great-grandparents, living in an age of terrible ignorance, without antibiotics, without an understanding of germs, without so many of the things we take for granted, were nonetheless reaching out in the dark and grasping again and again the right thing, the life-saving thing, guided by nothing more than careful watching and stubborn common sense and a deep and decent wish to keep the people they loved alive. They opened their windows and aired their sheets in the sun. They boiled their water for tea and scalded their milk over the fire. They washed their hands in the end and cleaned their wounds and built their sewers and vaccinated their children and quarantined their sick and covered their coughs and scrubbed their sick rooms white with lime. They got the reasons wrong almost every time, blaming bad air when the enemy was in the water, praising the pus that was really the poison, fearing the harmless dark of night. And yet, and this is the thing to carry down with you into sleep, the reasons did not matter nearly as much as the rules, and the rules, so many of them, were right, and saved more lives than all the bleeding and the mercury and the confident errors ever took. There is a deep and comforting wisdom in that, I think, the knowledge that you do not have to understand everything perfectly in order to do a great deal of good, that care and attention and simple decency can carry a person and a whole society a very long way through the dark. And now the fan is humming softly, and the room has grown warm and dim around you, and it is time to let all of it go. Let the busy streets of old London fade. Let the doctor with his map, and the lady with her lamp, and the milkmaids with their clear, bright faces drift away like figures seen through gently falling snow. You do not need to hold on to any of it now. You do not need to remember a single name or date or rule. All of that will keep until the morning, warm and safe in the back of your mind, and you can visit it again whenever you like. For now there is only this: the soft weight of the blankets, the slow rise and fall of your own quiet breathing, the gentle hush of the room. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper. Let your jaw unclench, and your hands go loose and heavy, and the small tightness behind your eyes melts slowly away. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. The long day is done, and the whole of the night is yours. And it asks nothing of you at all but that you rest. Breathe in slow and easy, and let it out even slower. Feel how heavy and warm your body has become, sinking down into the soft dark like a stone settling gently to the bottom of a still, deep pool. The lamplight is fading now. The voices are growing soft and far away. The window is open just a crack, the way the old ones would have wanted it. And the cool, clean night air is moving quietly over you, carrying nothing now but peace. Sleep well, wherever you are, in whatever hour of whatever night this finds you. You are safe, you are warm, you are cared for, and the strange kind people of that faraway age, who fought so hard and loved so fiercely and got so much of it right without ever quite knowing how, would be glad, I think, to know that you are resting easy tonight, in the gentle, well-aired, softly lit, quietly guarded world that all their blundering wisdom helped to build. Rest now, let go, drift. Good night, end of script, sweet dreams.